catch you with these arms that hold me back against this wall. Release me from these chains that hold me fast. You see, there's a light at the end that I'm running to. If you hold my hand, then I'll show you there's a lot more waiting for us all at the end of the road.
Well, our reading tonight is from 2 Corinthians. You don't have to be much of a Bible scholar to remember that the last time Paul wrote the Corinthian church, things were a little bit crazy. You'd have thought that he was addressing the cast of a reality TV show called Congregations Gone Wild. People were getting drunk during the Lord's Supper and then eating all of the food on the table that was being served before some members had even shown up. There's a particular member in the church that, shall we say, because there are children present, is romantically involved with a member of his own family. And there are members of the church that are bragging about it publicly, which is just gross. It's a theological term. Some Corinthians start babbling gibberish right in the middle of the church service, interrupting those that are speaking or preaching, and they claim that they are speaking in a type of angelic prayer language. Other members are still occasionally dropping by pagan cult worship services to eat the meat that is being sacrificed to the idols there. I don't understand what's going on with that particular bit. So when you're reading through Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, you've got to be quite impressed with how the congregation has turned things around. There's no drunk church events. There's no incest. They've clearly got their act together. But in Paul's mind, the Corinthians still have a problem that's kind of hard to understand in this second letter. Namely, it's a group of preachers called the super apostles. The Pauline scholar Krister Stendhal says that a better translation is the sunshine apostles that Paul is using to mock his opponents, almost certainly. And you've got to wonder as you're reading through 2 Corinthians, are these people, these sunshine apostles, really a problem for the church? Or is Paul just insecure that he's not really a great preacher? Maybe that's the reason that Paul spends so much time talking about how injured he has become, how persecuted, how often arrested for the sake of the gospel. Paul has suffered more than any of the sunshine apostles out of faith for Jesus Christ. The sunshine apostles don't seem to be preaching much of a message that is a risk to any of the powers that be. It's not threatening to anyone, while Paul's message is getting him arrested left and right. But where Paul really addresses the issue, we see that there are members of the Corinthian church that say that Paul's a great writer. He can write a powerful letter. But when he shows up in person to stand behind the pulpit, he's a little bit weak. The super apostles, or the sunshine apostles, however, are quite slick. They're polished. They're compelling. They preach with a smoke machine at the front of the stage, billowing up mist. There's a guy on the keyboards playing a mellow tune while they preach. They're about to release a set of DVDs for mini sermonettes for small group discussions. These guys are, at the very least, a sellable product. So, what's really the problem? All right, Paul's preaching's a little bit weak. So why is he talking so much about his legal troubles and suffering? Doesn't make a great sermon. You've got to wonder why Paul has such an acerbic dislike for the super apostles. Paul never accuses this group of professional preachers of teaching anything immoral or heretical. They're just more entertaining. So what? The Corinthians were getting plastered during church services and getting it on at family reunions, and Paul's mad just because now they found a group of figures that have a little bit more of a celebrity persona. You think he'd be happy for them. Maybe Paul's just insecure. Is 2 Corinthians really about the gospel? Or is it about Paul's battered self-esteem? That's really the question I'd like to lay before you tonight. And then at a certain point, at the point where Avis read this evening, Paul pulls out a pretty sweeping claim in the midst of talking about the super apostles, in which he writes, "So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone. The new is here." Wow, Paul. Really? Did you see what he was doing there? The church just likes more gripping presentations. And now Paul is about making it seem as if the Corinthians are seeing through a worldly point of view. We used to see Christ the same way, but now we don't, because the new creation has come. Come on, Paul. Seriously. Is the reason that the Corinthian church hasn't bought into Paul as the sole pastor because they are resisting the tides of the new creation, or just because Paul's a mediocre speaker? You've got to ask. You don't have to be very cynical when reading 2 Corinthians to see it almost as if a passive-aggressive grab for power by Paul. There are certain passages in Paul's letter that if you read it with a type of imitation, the voice of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, make perfect sense in the voice of Christopher Robin's depressed donkey friend. I'm going to try to do so now. "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." Do you feel the sympathy for Paul? But with all of the Paul hating that is kind of easy and effortless, not only in sermonizing about this book, but also in a liberal Protestant church like this one, where Paul bashing has kind of become in vogue in the last decade or so, I want to make a case that is somewhat unpopular. Now, the last time that I preached here, I started a sermon by saying that my least favorite movie genre was musicals, and I received hate mail for several days. I actually received a greeting card, one of those electronic ones that plays a song when you open it, and had an anonymous note written inside. I opened it, and it was the robotic voice of Annie singing, "The sun will come up tomorrow." The note read, "Not for you unless you keep your mouth shut." I found that particular greeting card rather harsh. But knowing that this is a critical audience, I still want to make an unpopular case. I want to make a case about Paul and how he sees new creation, and how it is rather unlike the bigger and better philosophy that we saw in the big fish clip earlier. I don't know if you listen to much Christian radio in Fort Worth or elsewhere. How can I say this nicely? It's pretty abysmal. And I think that it is, not because of the music or because I dislike the music at all, though it's not my preference. If you listen to a particular local radio station, which will go unnamed, the same opponents, the same problems, the same enemies to the gospel come up again and again and again in the voice of the radio commentators, and the list is always rather conventional. Abortion, same-sex marriage, the war on Christmas, the war on prayer in schools, teaching evolution in biology and science classes, and trying to take God out of the Constitution and government. Notice, the enemy of the gospel, from the perspective of most Christian radio, I'll just call them talking personalities, is always something found outside of the church. It's always those people. It's another community, and it's their ideas that are the enemy. And I want to make the case that 2 Corinthians and Paul's idea of new creation makes a rather startling case in the opposite direction. For Paul, the problem with the sunshine apostles is that they represent a form of spirituality whose not necessarily sole goal, but primary goal is to be engaging and dynamic and bring in an audience. He's not saying that the super apostles have a poor understanding of the ministry of Jesus or the scriptures. Paul isn't saying that they have immoral personal lives or they aren't emphasizing righteousness enough. Paul never claims that the apostles don't believe in grace or the resurrection of Christ or sanctification. The problem isn't in the content of the sunshine apostles and their message. It's in the format. And this is where I have to get a little bit theoretical. Right now, I'm not going to preach 2 Corinthians, and I'm not reading the mind of Paul. I just want to raise some ideas that might help us read this letter and our own context a little bit better. Especially when you look at Paul's scars and his suffering and why they continue to surface in 2 Corinthians as a counter to the life, the image, the rather flattering spotlight that's placed on the sunshine apostles. At first, it doesn't even seem to make sense. What does one even have to do with the other? It appears to be an irrelevant argument. When the super apostles offer up their resumes, Paul, and he says it kind of mockingly, he says they have impressive letters of recommendation from important people, I'm sure printed out on high-gloss paper. When you ask for Paul's resume, all he has to do is take off his tunic and show you his bare back. I was flogged. I have been stoned. I was shipwrecked. I have been imprisoned. Here's my resume. Here's my preaching on the gospel. Look at my wounds. For Paul, the new creation doesn't go against suffering, especially in the ancient world where if you're seen to have suffered a lot or be sick often, as most scholars are sure Paul suffered from some affliction. Back then that was seen as almost as a curse from God. If you suffer so much, if you're arrested so often, if you've had such a difficult life, if you're sick so frequently, how can you say that God is in favor of you? Your life doesn't seem to bear much mark of God's favor at all. To staff a church with the kind of people that look like the sunshine apostles isn't just to disregard Paul as the pastor. It's, in Paul's mind, to betray a misunderstanding of Jesus Christ himself. The church isn't supposed to be an entertainment venue where impressive preachers, teachers, and musicians just create larger and larger audiences of increasingly entertained and impressed and pleased people. That isn't the community of the gospel. That's the logic of Broadway, or a fitness gym, or a movie production company. And I think for Paul, a community of people that continues to go to church to have their needs met with entertaining ministers and ministries is ultimately maybe not a community that is ready for the return of Jesus, a Christ who pleased very few people and angered and confused many more with his sermons. Not much of a church grew up around Jesus. The thing is that the church of Corinth, a church that wants to show up for the Sunshine Apostles show, Paul doesn't believe that makes them a group of bad people, immoral, or even not taking their spirituality seriously. but they are probably a group of people that is so content and fulfilled by the mode of spirituality that keeps them coming to church on Sunday morning that it never contains any real risks. Life has enough suffering in store. Why more suffering just on the basis of your faith? Why be like Paul, scarred and frail and limping around? For Paul, we've got a hard message at a time where you can buy and commodify almost everything that is sold in the name of Christianity, whether it's a soundtrack, whether it's a sermon series, whether it's a t-shirt, whether it's a bracelet. Because for Paul to prefer comfort and entertainment and satisfaction over the frail truth of a scarred person isn't just a sign that you won't be going to Paul's church. It's a clear symptom that you still see the world through the eyes of the old creation and its concern for appearances and status. I wonder, what would Paul have to say if he swept in today's American churches with its swept floors and its beautiful architecture? Its ministers with impressive letters of recommendation and diplomas, and sermons that are at least partly engineered for their entertainment value. Not me, of course. Would we give poor old broken Paul a spot on our ministry staff? Would we make a place for this frail and limping man to speak a word of God to us in our finely pressed clothes? Would we take an unattractive, often offensive, obviously homeless person and let them guide us towards God? And when we, as nicely, as politely as possible, send that man away from us in favor of more professional, more relatable, more funny, and more likable proclaimers of the gospel, would we recognize that the man that we sent away was perhaps not just one of the apostles, but the King of the apostles, Jesus Christ himself? For Paul, this is what is at stake in living as a community of the new creation. It means that we want to be a people, we yearn to be a people that will find Christ wherever he is hidden, in any dark or modest corner of the globe, and not just those spotlit places where we feel like Christ and his message looks and sounds the best.
See, I catch you with these arms that hold me back against this wall. Release me from these chains that hold me fast. You see, there's a light at the end that I'm running to. If you hold my hand, then I'll show you there's a lot more waiting for us all at the end.